Okay, good morning, everybody. Glad everybody could join us today. I want to talk some about the history and the evolution, the development of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, and also talk somewhat about where it may be headed. So let me get some slides up here to talk from. If the system will work, we will try to make this happen. Call it slideshow and call it from beginning and see where we are. Okay. So the Skid Row area of Los Angeles, the city officially refers to it as Central City East. And it's about a 50-block area, 256 acres, and it's generally bounded by 3rd Street on the north, 7th Street on the south, Alameda Street on the east, and Main Street on the west. And that's, the city's official definition of the area. Organically, Skid Row is somewhat larger, but that's the area that the city technically defines as Skid Row. It's always useful to start with a little bit of kind of vocabulary history where the terminology of Skid Row comes from. And it originally was a skid road in Seattle, which was a road in which a lot of the lumber that was harvested in that area was brought to the top of a hill, and it was slid down a hill to a mill at the bottom of the hill. And so the street became known. It was not technically called Skid Row. It was Yesler Way, but it became known as the Skid Road. And because it was an area that was made up of small hotels and rooming houses and things of that nature, eventually that terminology of Skid Row got to be applied to very low income neighborhoods in cities kind of all over the place. It's important to put Skid Row into context because it's in an area that is surrounded by a number of other districts that are somewhat important. The Civic Center, Little Tokyo to its north, the Historic Core to its west, the Fashion District to its south, the Arts District to the east, and it overlaps with a wholesale district, which is really important because one of the key things that takes place in that district is food processing. And when you have people living on the streets, as you do in Skid Row right now, you do have potential health problems. And I'll get into some of that as we move forward. But one of the issues is that Skid Row is in the midst of an important economic engine for the city of Los Angeles. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. In terms of its geography and topography, it's in the Los Angeles River floodplain, which is one of the reasons that it developed differently from the area surrounding it. It is primarily low scale, whereas the areas to the west of Main Street are much higher scale. And part of the reason for that is that the floodplain of the Los Angeles River runs essentially from Main Street east to the bluffs of Boyle Heights. And in the days before the river was channelized, you did have a lot of opportunities, a lot of occasions when the river did flood. And it would flood almost over to Main Street in some cases. In fact, there was one flood that went over to Broadway, but that was really pretty unusual. So the area originally was very agricultural. It began to change in the 1870s when the railroads first came to Los Angeles, and they came to Los Angeles from the San Francisco area, which was the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. When the Transcontinental Railroad was started in the 1860s, finished up in the late 60s and early 70s, it was oriented from the Mississippi River over to San Francisco, which from anybody in the East's perspective was the only civilized place on the West Coast. So it was really a group of folks from Los Angeles who paid for an extension of the railroad to get it down to Los Angeles. And they brought it in along the river because that was the flattest route, and railroads operate really the best when they come through on essentially flat territory. So the 1870s into the 1910s was the era of the railroad's expansion. But along with being a terminal of the railroad, Los Angeles was also a place that had a lot of seasonal industries, especially because it was still at that point very much based on agriculture. So you needed workers to come in at the beginning of the growing season. You needed workers to come in at the end of the growing season. And many of the workers arrived on the trains. All of the stuff that was produced here was shipped out on the trains. And so it attracted a seasonal population of nomadic young males who were working in the area. And being young and male, they brought along with them a desire for not only low-cost hotels, but bars and brothels and other kinds of things that young, footloose males tended to engage in. And I guess still engage in when they have the opportunity. But the presence of the hotels and the bars and the brothels also brought the temperance movement to provide the clean living alternative to the bars and the brothels. And the significance of that is that that was the origin of the network of social service organizations that grew up in this part of town. And as the area continued to evolve, it became a more permanent, low-cost residential neighborhood, in contrast to Bunker Hill on the other side of downtown, which was the high-income neighborhood in central Los Angeles. Now, let's keep in mind that Los Angeles at that time essentially ran from the Pueblo to not very far south of what is today 6th Street. So we were talking about a substantially smaller city than we tend to think of when we tend to think of Los Angeles today. The Great Depression really had a major impact on the Skid Row area because it generated the displacement and the migration from the Midwest of people who lost their farms, lost their homes as a result of both the combination of the economic depression and what went along with it, a very serious drought in the middle part of the country, which resulted in a lot of loss of agricultural product, the country being, the central part of the country being referred to as the Dust Bowl because of the drought and the elimination or the loss of the agricultural product. And so a lot of people migrated to the West, attracted by the fact that places like Los Angeles had advertised themselves as kind of Eden. The weather was great, the climate was good, it was a wonderful place to live. And so people in the Midwest, because of the advertising that came out of Southern California, saw it as if, well, if we get to Southern California, that will be the end of all of our problems. It will be the arriving where the pot at the end of the rainbow is. And so everything will be good when we get there. Now, a lot of times that didn't work out. You had a lot of, as I say, people who were displaced from the middle of the country. They came out, what were in those days referred to as hobos, riding the rails. And they got here and found that they didn't have a skill set. They didn't have jobs because of the economy. They either were or became alcohol addicted. So you had a large population that were beginning to live in this area with alcohol addiction, without a whole lot of jobs, without a whole lot of skills other than the farming skills that they brought with them. And it was kind of interesting because that population continued to be the predominant population up until the 1960s. So you had a population that had migrated here looking for a better life. Some people succeeded and moved on from here. Other people just never got past the Skid Row area. And so it was a concentration of extremely low income, mostly white males, and many of them with alcohol addiction problems. Second World War brought war workers, military personnel, and particularly migrants from the South, particularly non-white migrants from the South, looking for jobs in the war industries. And because Los Angeles effectively was a segregated city, people of color were limited as to where they could live, mostly in neighborhoods that were close to railroad tracks. And so the Skid Row area was one, Watts was one. These were areas where populations of color were allowed to live. This area, because it had inexpensive housing and had the social services, it became an area that was attractive to migrant workers who were looking to get a first foothold in the area. After World War II, which followed the heels of the Depression, there were a lot of places in Los Angeles in which there really had not been any reinvestment, any improvements for a period of many, many years through the Depression and through the war. And there was a lot of pent-up demand for housing at that point. And the federal government came through with programs like the GI Bill that was primarily targeted to veterans, but primarily targeted to white veterans, and provided options for them to move to the suburbs. Now, one of the things to keep in mind was that the federal government in the Great Depression had tried to promote home construction as a way of getting construction workers back to work. And so there were a lot of incentives that were put into place to streamline the mortgage process, to make it easier for people to get mortgages. But at the same time, they also evaluated neighborhoods in most major metropolitan areas, and they ranked them. They ranked them as being good. They were given a color code of blue, as not really bad, given a color code of green, as kind of marginal and going through transition, and given a color code of yellow, and as undesirable places for banks to invest, or populated by people in which banks should not invest. And these tended to be people of color, neighborhoods of mixed use. And these were designated on the maps as red, which is the origin of the term redlining. In which many neighborhoods were simply cut off from the ability either to get mortgages to improve housing in those neighborhoods, or for residents to get mortgages to move to other communities. At the same time, racial covenants and other kinds of regulations made it very difficult for non-white people to move out. So the white population of the city tended to move to the suburb, in many cases aided by the GI Bill. And the inner city was vacated as these mobile, more middle-class people left, and it began to concentrate the populations, particularly populations of poorer people in the central city. Downtown area was specifically hurt by this out-migration because not only did residents move out, but businesses followed them. And so it became a place of last resort housing for very low-income individuals, persons in poverty, persons who were poor and elderly, tended to concentrate in and remain in the downtown area in an aging housing stock. Redevelopment started in downtown to try to address some of these issues and to begin to bring new investment into the core area. And it started, one, to try to slow the out-migration of businesses to the suburbs, and two, to address the blight. And the target area for a lot of that was the Bunker Hill neighborhood. Bunker Hill had been developed, as I said earlier, as a very high-income residential neighborhood. First generation moved in there, large mansions and so forth. The second generation moved to newer suburbs, and a lot of those large homes were converted over time into rooming houses or mixed commercial properties. And since the area was made up primarily of buildings that were wood buildings, they tended to be to deteriorate fairly quickly. And so by the 1930s and 40s, people were already complaining about deterioration on Bunker Hill. And by the 1950s, the situation had gotten really severe, and the city felt that they really needed to move in there and start to address the conditions, which included not only physical blight and concentrations of poverty, but poor health, very high rates of tuberculosis because of crowded living conditions and lack of sanitary facilities, for example. And so the city did begin to move to clear Bunker Hill of all of the structures, with the idea that they would be rebuilding it as a new in-town community and use that to stem the flow of migration out of the central city. But the clearance of Bunker Hill took 7,000 low-income units away, and that further contributed to the loss of business activity in the central core and contributed to the economic deterioration as well as physical deterioration of the neighborhood. While that was going on, the residential structures in Skid Row had dated back to the era of the railroads, the 1870s through the 1890s, and they were not up to code, seismic code, fire code, other codes. And the city, after clearing Bunker Hill, began a code enforcement program in Skid Row and said to the owners of these properties, these are unsafe. Recognize that they're providing a place for people to live, but they're unsafe, and you really have to bring them up to code, or you need to shut them down, close them down. And in many cases, the owners, looking at the rental income that they were able to get from the buildings, said, not enough money coming in to rehabilitate the buildings. It's not worth it. I'll just shut them down and start tearing them down, which was not the city's intent, but the result of it in the period from roughly 1965 to 1975 was that roughly 50% of the housing stock on Bunker Hill was demolished. And that was about 7,500 units that were removed. At the same time, there was a slow growth movement that was building in Los Angeles. People were saying, the city's getting overcrowded. We don't want to be in New Manhattan. So we're going to constrain housing in the city and around the city and a lot of other communities. The zoning, which had been fairly broad in terms of what it allowed, was cut back from multifamily into many neighborhoods into single family zones. And so the capacity for further housing to be built around the city of Los Angeles was constrained while people were still moving to Los Angeles. And so we started to get into a very serious imbalance between the creation of a housing supply and the demand for housing. And that began to drive up prices in housing. And that began displacing people. We're seeing still this situation of housing being out of balance between what is being produced and what is being demanded. And one of the most serious problems we're facing as a city right now is a lack of a good supply of housing. In a lot of cities where skid rows existed, the cities concluded that these were areas that were detrimental to the health of the city. They were costing more in terms of services, police, fire, health services, and they were generating in revenue. They were becoming concentrations of crime. And so a lot of cities moved in and started to demolish their skid row areas. Good example is the Bowery in New York, totally demolished. And in many cities, that's what happened. And so a plan was developed here in Los Angeles to do the same thing. The idea was that the area east of Main Street would be replaced by a university city with a community college, with offsite campuses for the major universities. And so Skid Row would be eliminated and replaced by this learning center. That plan was never implemented. And as a result, there were different options that were available for what could take place in the neighborhood. But what was also happening at the time, in addition to the slowdown in the creation of new housing in the city and the compression of places that were available for people to live, is that there was an increase in people suffering from mental illness and drug addiction in not only Los Angeles, but in a lot of places. And this was partially driven by people coming back from first Korea, then Vietnam, and then other war scenes with PTSD and with addiction to various kinds of drugs and other substances, but also because in the state of California, there was a move to close down mental institutions with a promise that there would be small-scale residential facilities that would provide on-site treatment. That network never happened. And so a lot of people with mental illness, suffering from mental illness, ended up on the streets, partly because they weren't getting treatment and partly because the nature of the way they acted up disrupted the communities in which they were living. They got kicked out of homes, they got kicked out of other neighborhoods. And because of the nature of Skid Row as being kind of a high tolerance neighborhood, people could come here and were able to kind of blend in with the population here. And it became kind of a place of last resort, not only for very low-income people, but for people with mental health needs and with post-traumatic stress and other alcohol and drug-induced traumas and syndromes that had to be dealt with. At a federal level, there was a move to try to address urban problems. It's kind of interesting. The United States, came into being in 1787 with the end of the Revolutionary War and the appropriation of the new Constitution. It wasn't until the 1960s that people began to look at the country as being urban as opposed to being rural. The sense of most people in the country was this is a rural place, even though by the 1960s, the majority of people were living in metropolitan areas. And so that led to some kind of interesting things during the 1960s, the creation of the Great Society, the concept of rebuilding cities, of reformulating with different kinds of educational systems, with different kinds of living systems and so forth, and really paying attention to the concentrations of poverty and so forth that had occurred in urban areas. This led to a change in expectations, which in a lot of cities led to high levels of frustration, which led to urban riots, which led to a change from the efforts of the Great Society to clamping down with the war on drugs instead. So we went from let's try to deal with bringing about the upgrade of our urban areas to let's clamp down on misbehavior. And so we went into an era of simply pushing down on people and abandoned the idea of trying to improve urban neighborhoods. Now, Los Angeles, we made a slightly different decision. In 1975, a new redevelopment plan was adopted for the core of the city, the downtown area, central business district. And it stopped the code-induced demolitions so that we had gone, as I said earlier, from 15,000 housing units in Skid Row to 7,500 before anybody really kind of figured out that what that was doing to the housing supply. And so rather than what was taking place in a lot of other cities, which was to demolish their Skid Rows, the idea here, having not embraced the university city plan, was to engage very heavily in the rehabilitation of dilapidated, deteriorated housing or the replacement of the housing that wasn't suitable for rehabilitation, to introduce a network of social services, and also to bring in the kinds of things that people in most neighborhoods have: parks, open space, places to shop, and so forth. So the idea was to treat this as a neighborhood. And it was referred to in a landmark 1976 report as a policy of containment. And the idea being that it was going to contain social services and housing and other amenities for a population of great need that was essentially not being provided for anywhere else in the city. And so it would not result in the demolition of any more housing. It would not result in the removal of this last resort neighborhood, but actually begin to stabilize it and create a place in which there would be protection from the demolition and the elimination of the housing stock and so forth. It also was seen by the city as a place where if housing was available, if services were available, if open space was available, people who were otherwise, kind of wandering around the rest of downtown and begging and squatting and so forth could be moved because they were seen as a barrier to the city's other efforts, which were to bring new investment into the rest of downtown Los Angeles. And it was hard to get people to invest in an area if all they saw were what in their minds were derelicts on street corners and in doorways. So focus that kind of activity in one neighborhood, east of Main Street, and hopefully that would make it easier for people to look favorably on investing in other parts of downtown Los Angeles and bringing back the economic health of the downtown community. Anyhow, the results in terms of the housing stock were about 3/4 of the then remaining housing units were rehabilitated, and a couple of thousand additional housing units were created in the area. And so there has been an influx of additional housing and the retention of a lot of the housing that was there. The containment plan did include a range of different kinds of uses, job training, parks, and open space to try to stabilize the community as a fairly stable, peaceful place for people to live. In the early 1990s, there were a lot of lawsuits among different public agencies. The city sued the county of Los Angeles over the amount that they were paying people under general relief, saying that it was insufficient for people to live. $221 a month was the standard payout. In fact, it hasn't changed since then. The county turned around and sued the city for not providing enough housing. They both turned around and sued the redevelopment agency for having demolished 7,000 units on Bunker Hill. So several $1 million of legal fees later resulted in a compromise settlement agreement that created the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LAHSA, as a channel that would be to address homelessness across the city. Subsequent changes made LAHSA essentially a funding channel. They did not have the authority to build housing. They didn't have the authority to stop demolition. They became the place in which all of the different funding sources that provided for services or provided for the construction of housing would be funneled to potential developers, be they nonprofit organizations or public agencies that would be engaged in that. So it was at least an effort to try to rationalize the social service network. It, in combination with redevelopment agency funding and city funding a lot of housing, by the mid-1990s had shown measurable improvements. The average number of people living on the streets had dropped from 2,000 to about 700 per night through housing preservation and rehabilitation, but then struck the recessions of the mid-90s and the 2000s, which struck the middle class for the first time, and which pushed a lot of people into homelessness that hadn't previously been there. That, combined with burgeoning housing costs in Los Angeles, pushed a lot of people to last resort housing in Skid Row. So it compounded the number of people living on the streets or looking for shelter in this area. And people were both attracted to Skid Row because the social services were there, and delivered to Skid Row by outlying communities because the social services were there. So we're now at a situation where we've got about 3,500 to 4,000 people living in transitional housing, shelters, tents on the streets, and about 6,000 to 8,000 people living in hotels in permanent housing in the neighborhood, but still a very strong, large number of people living on the streets. Living on the streets makes it difficult for people to get any kind of stability. It contributes to an increase in mental illness. It contributes to a propensity of people to turn to drugs and other substances, and thus becomes even more debilitating to the populations. And so today we're facing a shortage of housing. We're facing increasing housing rents. We're facing a lot of people wanting to see something done about taking care of the Skid Row population and the homeless population throughout the city, but at the same time, people resisting having facilities built in different neighborhoods. Federal government brought this to a head in 2004 when they directed cities to create plans to end homelessness. And they said, you got 10 years to do it. Come up with your plan and show how you're going to end homelessness. The first issue that we had to deal with here, and our plan was called Bring LA Home, it was delivered in 2006, was to decide among the social service entities, both public and nonprofit, what should be your focus. And there was one cluster of people in social service who said, you treat people where they are, and then after you get them stabilized where they are, then you work on getting them housed. And another side of the sector said, get them into housing first, and it's a whole lot easier to treat people once you've got them housed. And so the majority of the time between 2004 and 2006 was spent arguing over that, and finally came down to the side that said, get people into housing first, because once they're in housing, they're set, they're in a location, you can deliver services to them, you can begin to provide counseling. When you're treating them on the street, they may get services one day and you come back to, give them, the next round of medicine, and they're no longer there. They're at some other corner, or they're somewhere else in the neighborhood. And so there's really no ability to stabilize people if you don't get them into some kind of stabilized situation. The thought was to focus on what's called permanent supportive housing, which is a combination of housing with on-site services, counseling, treatment, medical, mental, job training, et cetera, all within the same complex. And this provided the greatest opportunity to start getting people stabilized, understanding that if you gave people a decent place to live, that would be the first step in getting them out of their chronic situation of potentially drug abuse or PTSD or whatever other conditions they were working with, and to target some initial populations that needed to be dealt with, people who had been on the streets for many, many years, people who were veterans who had come back with illnesses and ended up homeless, and other populations such as women and women with children. The housing model evolved over time from the original, which was just provide a small room, bathroom at the end of the hall, the so-called single room occupancy model, which was an 8 by 10 room, had a bed, had a dresser, had a sink, and other than that, the bathrooms were down the hall, you didn't have kitchen facilities, and move instead to a very small micro efficiency unit where you had in-house, in the unit, your own bathroom and a small kitchenette. Although most of the housing also provided larger kitchens for part of a re-socialization program for people who would kind of, by virtue of being on the streets for a long period of time and not having social interaction, lost the ability to interact properly with other human beings. And so part of the supportive housing program was to re-socialize individuals. The funding agencies really embraced the concept of permanent supportive housing. But what was unfortunate about that was they took money away from the first step of getting people out of homelessness, which was shelters and temporary or transitional housing. And so there was a gap in the supply of these first steps of getting somebody out of homelessness. And if someone has been on the street homeless for a long period of time, their sense of trust in other human beings was pretty slight. It took a long time to get people to even talk to you. It took a long time for them to even think of getting off the street or out of their tent into some other situation. And you frequently had to transition them from living on the street to living in a controlled but still outdoor environment, to getting them encouraged to move to an indoor location, to getting them stable to the point of being able to move into their own housing stock. So there really was a long period that needed to be transitional. And as limited amounts of money for dealing with the housing crisis were shifted more and more to permanent housing, that link to the short-term interim transitional housing and the funding for it went away. And so that link got broken, and that made it even more difficult to move further. A couple of other things that are important to keep in mind about Skid Row is geographically, it shares its land with the Toy District and the Food District. Mm. The Toy District is an important part of the local economy, although this is changing because a lot of the big stores are now beginning to buy directly from manufacturers, particularly in Asia, where the Toy District was essentially the intermediate wholesale step. But the Toy District still generates over $1 billion in annual sales. The Seafood District is kind of an interesting one. And it has been changing fairly dramatically in the last several years. For a long time, the wholesale seafood district was a place where fish that were caught offshore in the Pacific, obviously, were brought into downtown, processed, packaged, frozen, and then shipped all over the world. And some of it was used locally, but a lot of it was shipped over the world. In fact, there was a lot of fish that was shipped to other places in the world and then shipped back and put on the supermarket shelves here in Los Angeles, which means you might be buying fish that had traveled a whole lot more than you ever had. But with the shift to fresh food, the freezing component went away. And so the seafood district is evolving into a place of fresh fish and other product for local consumption. Now, this creates a serious potential health problem, because if you have people living on the streets where you're processing fish and it's being packaged and frozen and so forth and put into trucks, it's not a big deal. But if you're processing fresh food and bringing it in and shipping it out, and you have people living on the streets who don't have sanitary facilities, places to wash, places to go to the bathroom, there is a serious potential for a major health epidemic at some point to occur. And we've been very lucky so far with relatively small outbreaks of hepatitis and a few other infectious diseases, but we haven't yet faced a serious outbreak. And so, getting people off the streets in the food district is really a high priority. Another thing that's kind of important to what's happened and what's happening in Skid Row right now is when that containment policy was adopted in 1976, Skid Row is in many cases relatively isolated from other activity centers. The buildings along Main Street, Spring Street, Broadway that are now the historic district were largely vacant or lightly occupied. RTD was in one building, CRA was in one building, and hardly anything else was in any of the other buildings. So there wasn't a population in those kind of three buffer blocks between the core of downtown and Skid Row. Little Tokyo was a block further away with just a strip of surface parking lots separating it from the northern edge of Skid Row. The Arts District was much smaller and further over than it was. The Fashion District and the Flower Market were very internally focused. And so the southern edge was not an area that there was a whole lot of interaction between Skid Row and its surrounding neighborhoods. It is now, the Skid Row area is now surrounded by expanding and gentrifying districts. The loft area of downtown, 7,500, 1,000, 10,000 loft units in restored buildings and some new construction from Main Street over to Hill Street. Little Tokyo has filled in all the way to 3rd Street. The Arts District has come in all the way to Alameda Street. So there are now areas that are very densely occupied that immediately surround Skid Row and butt up against it every day. And so that's causing some potential problems of interaction with populations, as well as pressure on Skid Row to start looking at intrusions into the area of other types of development that might be more economically viable. The city has been going through a very extensive update to its community plan starting in the downtown. And so they're trying to balance the needs for very low-income housing and shelter in this neighborhood with the demands for economic development that partially overlap it because of the toy district and the wholesale food district and so forth, but are also affecting the regrowth of other parts of the downtown. One of the things that was kind of interesting in the recession starting in the 1990s was that it, as I said earlier, hit primarily on the middle class. And so there was a reduction in traditional office jobs in the financial district portion of downtown. But there was a corresponding increase in industrial jobs in the area to the east, the fashion district, the flower district, the seafood district, the other parts of the wholesale district saw employment increasing while office employment was going down. And so the balance between Skid Row and what had been a growing financial district to its west now shifted to a growing impact of an industrial district to its east. That industrial change is now going through another change as the arts district continues to expand and downtown becomes a center of kind of creative activity. And the creative folks are moving first into the arts district. Arts district, by the way, is now the most expensive part of downtown Los Angeles. The median income in the arts district is over $100,000 compared to $93,000 in the loft district, and $48,000 is kind of downtown overall. So it's a very expensive area. And it is now beginning to push out the first folks who moved into the arts district into the fashion district. So fashion district is now becoming son of arts district or arts district light. And that's kind of pushing the industrial activity even further south. So there's some interesting changes that are taking place in the economy that surrounds Skid Row that the plan is trying to address and balance. So applying a commercial mix of zoning east of San Pedro Street, which is kind of a break point in Skid Row, to allow for the retention and expansion of these businesses, and concentrating the housing area roughly between Main Street and San Pedro Street seems to be the direction they're going, except they've also identified a quadrant in the southeastern part of downtown that they see as the next growth area for heavily affordable housing. So the new housing is aimed at creating deeply affordable housing, but allowing higher density and taller buildings, which is an interesting shift. And it's also promoting the investigation of new and different kinds of housing technologies in the downtown. So these three illustrations are illustrations of some of what's going on. The one that's the top left is a building that is 100% modular. These are all prefabricated units that were built off-site, trucked in and stacked to create housing. Fairly inexpensive way of creating housing. The lower left is a shift toward a much higher, taller building for affordable housing in Skid Row. The sense being, if we can build 20, 30-story residential buildings for individuals and households, small households on the west side of downtown, we should be able to build high-density housing on the east side of downtown as well, even if the demographics of the population are different. And a very interesting project, the one that is on the right, is a proposal by Skid Row Housing Trust for a totally new technology, which is high-rise timber construction. It's actually a wood structure building that would rise for about 18 stories. And right now, our building codes and our fire department are freaked out over that. But it's going to be real interesting to see as this begins to happening. And there are lots of models that so far are being built in Europe, but not yet embraced here in the States. And it's going to be an interesting argument because we have social agencies that are building affordable housing saying it's a whole lot cheaper to do this high density timber as opposed to concrete and steel, which is the most expensive form of construction. And a fire department that is saying, not only don't we like this idea, but we think that some of the freestanding 5 and 6 story wood frame buildings that are being built now shouldn't be allowed either. We should make everything concrete and steel in the downtown. So it's going to be a real interesting set of conversations. So what are some of the major issues that are facing the neighborhood that we have to deal with? When it started, and up until the mid 90s, when we started to see people being pushed out of middle class jobs, it was essentially almost 100% adult male population. We started to see the arrivals of first women, then women with children, and then men with children during the recession of the 90s. And so we have this mix. As I said earlier, this market rate housing is expanding in surrounding neighborhoods, and that's putting pressure on the Skid Row geography. And within the city, we're recognizing that there's a demand for what we call workforce housing, not only in the downtown, but in some of the other places, because technically affordable housing that qualifies for government assistance only is available to people at roughly $60,000 in income and below. And housing that is available on the open market basically works for people who are earning $150,000 a year or more. And so there's that gap that is not funded by anybody that is made up of people in that what we call the missing middle range, who are today struggling to pay for housing at 50, 55, 60% of their income going into housing. So there are a couple of policy questions. One, should we maintain Skid Row's adult-only housing or allow for more housing? Should we expand the income mix from what is now extremely low and very low income housing? Or should we be decentralizing housing and social services to other neighborhoods rather than depending on Skid Row as kind of the heart of all the social services in Los Angeles? And let's keep in mind, Skid Row is 50 blocks, 256 acres. And that's well less than a quarter of a square mile in a city of 470 square miles and a county of 4,000 square miles. And so to try to assume that we can handle all of the needs of our homeless population in 50 city blocks is totally unrealistic, but we need to convince other cities and other neighborhoods of that. Office jobs have declined, industrial growth is growing. The maker industry, creative industry are growing. They're competing for the industrial space that is now being used by produce and flour and food. So there's a need to take a look at those new jobs and where we can retain the jobs that are the lower skilled, mostly food oriented manufacturing activities that are to a large measure dependent on people who live nearby and use transit to get to them. There's been a push that says we can move our industrial jobs to the far San Fernando Valley, to the Inland Empire. But a lot of people who work in those jobs are transit dependent. If those jobs move too far, they're not going to be able to continue to work here. So we'd be contributing to an unemployment of particularly lower skilled, lower income people. So balancing the industrial jobs and balancing the kinds of industrial jobs are issues that we have to deal with. So what is the future role of Skid Row in the context of downtown? Should it be only last resort housing, or should it have a mix of other kinds of housing? And if so, what's the mix? Should there be a regional homeless program as a part of decentralizing these services? If you start looking at family housing, you need to look at different amenities than an all adult housing community. You need more parks, you need schools, you need other kinds of facilities that serve families. And if you start to introduce them in a small geography like Skid Row, where does it go and what does it kick out? Who gets moved out to provide the space for those kinds of facilities? And again, the commercial and industrial sector is a vital contributor to the LA economy. So we're starting to move in a couple of directions. One is to concentrate on the delivery of service-enriched housing, permanent supportive housing, with a focus on special needs populations and on-site services. So there's a very detailed analysis that needs to be done to rationalize where you do this and how you can do it in a way that doesn't deprive businesses of being able to continue to exist and operate in the neighborhood. There really is a very serious need to coordinate the city, county, state, federal, and private funding. There's talk going on right now of creating a new county homeless services delivery agency. We've created through bond measures at both the local and state level, big streams of revenue for housing. We really need to talk about concentrating them in specific geographic areas. Yeah, it's really important that if we're going to target housing and services to particular neighborhoods, we target the money we've got there. We need to set realistic numbers for reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness. We are actually rehousing about 21,000 people a year coming out of Skid Row and other homeless encampments. We are at the same time, because housing is so short in supply and so expensive, delivering about 22,000 new people a year into homelessness. And so we really need to cut off that pipeline. We need to take a look at the social service network. We rely too heavily on the police department as being the first responder for what in many cases are people experiencing mental issues rather than crime issues. And we really need to redirect funding to social service staff to be able to handle those kinds of issues and those kinds of questions. So these are some of the steps that are taking place. These are some of the kinds of things that we need to deal with. And let me stop talking and kind of open up for any questions or thoughts that people may have. There's one final point, again, to acknowledge we can't deliver all of the services for Skid Row, but for the homeless population in metropolitan Los Angeles by only depending on Skid Row. So let me stop sharing and stop talking. And I know I threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully it was interesting. Any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions?
Okay, how about Jill first, then Tony, and then we'll take others from there.
The wood and timber buildings and the modular ones that are stacked, how is that with earthquake safety?
The timber is the timber is more flexible actually than steel and concrete. So the expectation, and we don't have any timber buildings here that are tall buildings, but even of our shorter buildings, the timber buildings for the most part flex well. Where we've had damage in timber buildings in the past, it's because of rigid and not well supported concrete podiums that are underneath them. So the concrete that we use for some of the 1960s era concrete podium, wood on top buildings, it was the concrete section of the building that failed, not the wood portion of the building. With regard to the modular is fine. The modular is designed to be into a frame that can flex. And we're seeing more modular buildings. They've actually done quite a few up in San Jose that are fairly tall buildings. We have a relatively small number here, but they've done fine.
Okay, Tony?
First a comment, then a question. In 1908, my uncle moved into the Hayward Hotel. He was a haberdasher and he was going to stay a few days. And he stayed there over 50 years. And so as a small child, Sundays were spent going to visit him. So that was my introduction to Skid Row as a child. And it was much different, of course, than it is now.
Yep.
In later years, I worked at the Bank of America original building on Spring and 7th as an intern with mental health advocacy that was housed there at the time. And my question is, who paid for the small modular construction and who paid for the high-rise construction? Because there's a lot of talk about the Proposition HHH funding not being used or being underutilized. And we're only talking about Skid Row, but these problems extend to our areas as well and concern everybody. And I made some efforts about 3 years ago, writing to the various powers that be with a plan to utilize our Veterans Administration that's empty and underutilized. And there were no takers from the state senators, the feds, or Eli Broad, who at the time was still alive, and his expertise is, of course, housing construction.
Right.
So who paid for the construction of these, and are they full at this point in time?
Okay, the buildings down in Skid Row and essentially all the affordable housing buildings in Los Angeles are full. The last couple of buildings were paid for by HHH. A lot of the buildings predate that, and so the modular construction building that I showed there was funded partly by the city housing department, partly by the redevelopment agency, and the balance was by funds that were collected by the nonprofit that is the actual developer of it, and a mortgage for what portion of the building could be financed on the basis of rental income, which is a relatively small portion of the total. Buildings that are being built now, or that are in the funding stream, which hopefully will include the timber building, are using Triple H. They're using state housing bonds. They're using low-income housing tax credits, and they're using funds that are set aside by certain banks that participate in a program called the Community Reinvestment Act, which mandates that there be a certain amount of investment that go into underserved neighborhoods. And right now, one of the biggest funding sources is the state of California, which did a $2 billion bond last year, and it's got another bond coming up probably in either the next election or the one thereafter. So a lot of money is coming from state bonds. Federal government is not yet at this point a big source of funding. And the low-income housing tax credit program took a big hit in the 2017 Tax Act when it reduced corporate taxes, because the value of a tax credit went down when the taxes that they had to pay went down.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, other questions?
I had to step out of the room for a minute, so excuse me if I'm asking a question. It's repeated. It's a little bit off the topic of downtown LA, but here in our area of the San Fernando Valley, there's a major development going in at the terminus of the Red Line station, which has almost no affordable housing, 20% in it. There's a group that's opposing this, trying to get more affordable housing in. And we're trying to figure out how best to encourage Metro and the housing, LA City planning, to see that there's a crying need for more than 20% housing in this large project. Are there any recommendations you have?
Yeah, the 20% number comes out of historically having done a lot of analysis on how much a development can, quote unquote, afford to lose revenue, if you will, from affordable units. And part of it depends on the spread between what an affordable housing number is, and those numbers are set by the federal government, and what the market will support. And so part of the trade-off that the city has used is to say, we will provide an incentive, which is to give developers the ability to do more housing in total on a site, in exchange for which they deliver affordable units. way in which the formula works is that the deeper the affordability, the smaller number of units you have to produce because of that economic difference between the market and the affordable price. And so it was a formulaic analysis that was done when that program started. And it concluded that if you're doing extremely low income housing, 9 to 11%, if you're doing low income, about 20, 21%. To get a higher proportion of that would probably mean putting in more subsidy. So there are a couple of ways of doing that. One is for the government to make the property it owns available at a substantially reduced price or free to the housing developer. The other is to look at what are the kinds of things that are part of the cost of development that you can remove. So for example, in a lot of areas, our zoning code requires a substantial amount of parking to be built for residential units. We're slowly changing the ordinance to reduce that number. But when you figure that it's costing about $30,000 to $40,000 a parking space to build parking, and you're requiring right now 1.5 to 2 units for a family-sized unit, residential unit, that is going to cost you itself about $200,000 to $300,000 to build. Knock off one parking space and you've taken 10% off the cost of the housing per unit. So reduce what you're charging a developer for the land, give them an additional density bonus. The cap on the density bonus is that when you get above a certain number of stories of the building, your construction type changes, so the economics of that building will be different. If you're going to a building that has to be concrete and steel as opposed to a building that is concrete deck with wood above it. So those are two things that you can do: reduce the amount of parking, reduce the price for the land, move certain other costs off the developer. Don't charge the developer for the housing linkage fee in a building that has a substantial amount of affordable housing, as opposed to if you only do the minimum, the 10 or 20%, you don't have to pay the fee on the 10 or the 20% of the units. If you want to get a housing development to include, say, 30% affordable units, then reduce the fee you're charging on the other market rate units. Take away the open space fee and adjust the burden on people who are doing no affordable housing so that they pay a larger share of it. So those are a couple of things that could be done.
Thank you.
Janet?
First, I want to thank you for an incredible presentation. I mean, it just brings to light how complicated the solution is going to be for this, that it just incorporates so many divisions of government and funding and whatnot. Anyway, my question, this was way back, well, the time when I was working with Chrysalis, Leonide Hotel, that was back in the 80s when they were building that. And they had found, I mean, everything was privately funded because they found there were so many restrictions if they had to deal with city government or any kind of bureaucratic organizations. And I'm assuming that changing now, I mean, especially because the problem is just getting bigger and bigger. But then my second question, private, nonprofit, I should say, organizations like Shelter Partnership or Downtown Women's Center, Union Rescue Mission and whatnot, are they effective, or is it just a small, very small sector, or can they be like a model for larger kinds of solutions?
Union Rescue Mission, because it's a religious institution, doesn't take any public money, nor do Los Angeles Mission or Midnight Mission. Downtown Women's Center has gotten money in the past from city and state sources. They use the low-income housing tax credits. The big change, hopefully in the next year or so, will be that the state will change the regulations where all the different funding sources today have their own application process and requirements for what an application consists of and timelines. And they will streamline it and say there's a universal application for any housing funding source that moves through a municipality or the state of California. So it'll take you down from now 9 different applications to hopefully 1 or 2 applications to be able to get funding. The nonprofit sector builds a substantial amount of affordable housing. Now, for the most part, the nonprofit sector focuses on 100% affordable. So like Downtown Women's Center right now is doubling the number of units they have. The for-profit sector goes for the mixed income housing. And so there it's the incentives like the bonus density and the reduction in parking that make the most sense to be able to encourage private sector to provide affordable housing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Don, I don't know how much time you've got, but we'll take Gary's question and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. Once again, I learned a lot from your program, Don, and
Yep.
fight on. But my question is, we pass city and county bond issues for dealing with the homeless. Where is all that money gone?
The county money is for services. And so it's being programmed out over a multi-year period. So when we talk about permanent supportive housing, the support part is paid for by the county. And so they contract with nonprofits directly to provide services, or they contract with nonprofit housing developers to subcontract with providers so that there is social service money in those projects. The Triple H, which was the city's bond issue, is being allocated. At this point, the vast majority of it has been allocated. It's taken way longer than anybody had hoped to get the first units built, but they are now built and open, and there's more stuff in the pipeline. So that money is largely spoken for. They did reserve a portion of it for what they call creative solution. So they're asking, they have asked, because they've already got the submittals, they have asked architects and others to provide design schemes for more inexpensive ways of delivering housing, and particularly for putting housing into low density neighborhoods so that they won't be physically intrusive. And so they're looking at that. I want them to look at the high rise timber as one of the options, because I think there's a lot of promise there.
Okay. Anybody else? If not, Don, I want to thank you very much on behalf of High Neighbors and all of us for an outstanding presentation. And this will be posted as soon as it clears on my system and I can put it onto the video library. So thank you, and
Thanks everybody for participating and for sticking with us.
we'll
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, thank you. This was great.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.